Good evening. I'm Ann Shepard, and I am a teacher, a writer, and an athlete. For 30 years, I have been helping people overcome the effects of trauma, grief, and loss. I've worked in schools, in churches, in nonprofits. I've worked in the mountains and in the deserts. I've worked with children. I've worked with veterans, and I've worked with people who have sustained unexpected physical and emotional injuries. But none of that could have prepared me for the greatest tragedy of my life. On October 29th, 2021, my son Nolan committed suicide. This evening, I'm going to share a peek into my grief journey. I'll share with you some of the pioneers of research, as well as some of the suggestions from new fields of neuroscience. I'll show everything that I thought that I knew about grief, and everything that I didn't know that I didn't know. Most important, I'll share with you 4 radical steps that I took to mobilize my grief and to keep love alive. Number 1, movement. In the early days after Nolan passed, some of my best intended friends and family pointed my direction to the 5 stages of grief. Most of you know them. The work comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But grief is not linear. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself came back later to say, actually, grief is more of a spiral. And some of us may not even engage in all 5 stages. The best advice I got was from my best friend, Master Medical Doctor Jacqueline Fields. She told me, you're going to have to move it. And I knew she was right. See, from my professional experience, I knew trauma lives in the limbic system. That's the part of the brain that equips us when hard things happen, emergencies. It's the part of the brain that's mechanized to help us to fight, to flee. Sometimes we freeze or fawn. The risk, however, is that trauma can spiral and get stuck. And so I had to move it. Luckily, Nolan had been the best teacher. I wrote in my book about him that Nolan came in on a lightning bolt. And I talk about how I had to train for long-distance triathlons, not so much for the love of the sport, but in order to maintain enough endurance to keep up with him. I knew all about moving it, because our lives had been touched already by adversity, by alcoholism, abuse, and abandonment. While some parents clung to the smell of their children on the bed sheets or photographs or the last things they touched, I clung to my adventures with Nolan. Quickly, I found myself registered for long-distance trail runs. I even registered for a 40-mile ski mountaineering race from Crested Butte to Aspen, Colorado. See, Nolan was my ski partner, and he had been the youngest athlete to complete that race when he was just 15 years old. I started ticking off things on our bucket list, the things that we hadn't had the chance to do. I got to hike sections of the Appalachian Trail with my daughter, and later with my husband and his family. But the last grand adventure was Nolan's last wish of me. On his suicide note, his last love letter, he scribbled as an afterthought, "Spread the ashes somewhere in Japan. I've always wanted to go, and I'd like you all to see it too." So with the help of my husband and a local Japanese ski guide, I was able to ski Nolan's ashes to the top of the highest volcano in Hokkaido, Japan, Mount Tokichidake. Against low visibility and radars that said the clouds were too thick, the sun kept coming out. And a funny side story, I asked the guide, how often does this thing erupt? And he said, about every 30 years. And I said, well, when was the last time? And he said, 1989. This was February of 2022. And I thought, wow, that is so Nolan. These adventures allowed me to shift gears, to literally move this trauma to another part of my brain where I could begin to talk about it. But I had some great teachers from some unexpected sources. And the days after Nolan passed, I got an email from one of his dearest friends, Morgan, here at MSU. Morgan and 10 of Nolan's other best friends composed a video documentary, the details of where they met Nolan and the impact that he had made on their lives. There were redundant words about Nolan's generosity, his kindness, his selflessness, and his love. See, the boys, and that's spelled B-O-Y-Z, in case you wanted to know, the boys, were doing something incredibly brilliant. They were grounding their grief. They were creating relationship to it. And that 6-minute video became the legacy of Nolan's impact. It made it to Colorado, back to Maryland, and even to Japan, and was the centerpiece to the celebrations of life for Nolan. After the funerals, after everybody went home, after the last casserole came to my doorstep, I found myself in that club that nobody wants to belong to. See, there still weren't words for the pain that I was feeling. And so I turned to my sacred teachings. I spent a lot of time in the book of Job, and I also referred to some of the native teachings that I've been so fortunate to pick up along the way. I'd raised my children in a lot of the rites of passage from the Sioux, and as I opened my book, The Sacred Pipe, which is Black Elk's account of those rites of passage, I read about a ceremony of keeping a soul. Literally, it was the story of a father whose son had died. He went to the elders and said, what am I to do about my son who I loved so much? And in that account, there is a step-by-step process of taking a lock of your beloved child's hair, blessing it in a ribbon of smoke from a braid of sweetgrass, and placing it in a deerskin pouch. And what was so beautiful about that was in the hours after Nolan passed, I had this compulsion, and I just needed his hair. Luckily, the coroner was a friend of the family, and I could just call him and say, I need Nolan's braid. I had fussed with Nolan for years to get a haircut, and I was so grateful he didn't listen to me. We're beyond coincidence at this point that just the day before, my dear friend gave me this pouch with the Lakota cardinal direction medicine wheel imprinted on the center of what represents Turtle Island. And what I was to do was to carry Nolan for a year and to carry myself and those who loved him in a circle of protection, of love and reverence for everything that he had given to us. And see, this was such a comfort to me, This was such a comfort to me because nobody was telling me what to do. Beyond comforting me in my isolation, this gave me a vehicle to help others. I wasn't the only one that lost Nolan. There were many other people grieving. So quickly I found myself on my way to Bozeman. I was able to circle up the boys. This is a couple of them. We skied him into Fairy Lakes, his most favorite place to make a fire and maybe party a little bit. And for days we ate and we told stories. They told me stories about Nolan's time here on campus, some things I probably wouldn't have learned from Nolan. And they learned some things about Nolan from his childhood that he would have been terribly embarrassed for me to tell. But we were doing something profound and critical. You see, none of us were alone in that grief. The boys weren't sitting in isolation with whatever survivor's guilt they were feeling. And we banded together as a circle, as a family, to keep Nolan's legacy alive. After that, I was able to write some of these stories down. And even in the act of writing, I realized that I wasn't just telling the stories of Nolan's life. I was telling the story of our lives after Nolan. And see, this is key in terms of the brain research. In Bessel van der Kolk's famous book, The Body Keeps the Score, he distinguishes the parts of the brain that are able to process trauma and grief. The amygdala there is what I talked about as the limbic system, the part that's able to respond quickly when unimaginable things happen. But as we move that trauma and grief to the front of the brain, to the medial prefrontal cortex, that's where language lives. So by moving it and then telling the stories and writing it down, literally I was engaging in an autobiographical process that allowed the front of my brain to heal the emotional brain. Beyond that, I was literally writing my story for the next chapter. And so I wrote a book, I got married, I went to Japan, I went to Maryland, and in this next chapter I was committed to starting anew. We would pack our belongings and move to northwestern Montana to be near our children. But life doesn't always go as we think it's going to go. And literally, as we were driving across the country, we got a phone call from another one of our children who was in crisis. My husband's son was in Colorado, and my husband would have to detour and remain with him for 6 months. I got a phone call that the publisher of my book had gone into a merger, and my book agent said, "This is far too sensitive to fall through the cracks." Remember, trauma is sticky, and when bad things start to happen and stress starts to mount, we start to spiral again. I wanted to fight, run, freeze, fawn, and simply fall to the ground. See, trauma, especially when we incur repetitive trauma, threatens us. Levi Lesko is a pastor at Fresh Life Church in Kalispell, Montana. He also lost a child, Linnea, when she was just 8 years old. So he knows this journey. And he says the risk is that trauma can become the template. In fact, when trauma gets stuck, we tend to gravitate to the dysfunction of avoiding more of life's disappointments. We gravitate to the comfort of just laying on the ground, and we miss our calling. See, I believe that our messes become our messages, as long as we don't allow fear to overcome our faith. And we don't let the pain of the past steal the gift of this present. And I knew what to do because I had my steps. I had to move it. Step number 1. I pointed my FJ straight to Bozeman. It was where my precious daughter Tessa was. It was where I could circle up the boys and get into the mountains and where the sun shines. The first thing I did within the first 2 days that I was here is I volunteered for a running research project. I found myself in the kinesiology lab with sensors strapped all to my body and a VO2 mask, and they put me on the treadmill and said, "Go until you blow up." The next day, they had the nerve to take me to the M And for those of you who aren't from Bozeman, it's a gnarly trail that goes straight up beyond the M, just another half mile to the ridge, as fast as you can, and we'll meet you there. Now that got it done. I was breathing and feeling and back in my body, and certainly I had moved it from my limbic system. The next thing I needed to do was tell the story. I caught Matt Kairis. He's the dean of students here at MSU, but he was also Nolan's professor. Matt took me just upstairs to the classroom where Nolan last sat. He showed me his chair and where his friend Grace sat across the table from him. And we told Nolan stories. I told Matt about the boys and about Japan, and soon Nolan's heart filled that room again. Within weeks, the dean of the Honors College invited me to her office. She would offer me to teach 2 sections of text and critics. I thought by the recommendation of Matt, but as it turned out, it was one of the young women from the Running Research Project. So every day for 2 hours, I get to sit with my beloved students. The Text and Critics is a required first-year course for the Honors College, and we read and study and discuss great literature, sacred and historic texts, the great thinkers and scientists and philosophers. Literally, we contemplate the meaning of life, individual and collective responsibility, and how we might all leave a personal legacy. I'm the teacher, but only by title. Rest assured, I'm learning so much. And it's so important because only through the learning part of my brain can I continue to go on. Mary Frances O'Connor describes it best in her new book, The Grieving Brain. She says, we all have a map, and on that map are our beloveds and how they're situated in our world. She draws the analogy of the dining room table. We all have a map in our mind. We don't need to turn on the light switch at night when we go to the bathroom. We know we better jog to the right so we don't hit our hip on the left. But when our loved one is suddenly gone, our map tries to process that, and it can't. Who stole the dining room table? And where is my beloved Nolan? The dissonance and the confusion is not able to be reconciled, she says, unless we learn a new neural pathway, we create new attachment bonds, and create a new map that helps us to navigate our way forward without our loved one there, at least in the physical form. Which lands me here tonight doing a TED Talk, sharing my story. It was by the organizer's invitation, who happened to be the assistant researcher on the running project. It turns out that on the trail, we got to share stories, and she had her own story of grief and loss. And it's in that way that we not only mobilize our grief, but we're mobilizing a fearless community. Since being invited to talk to you this evening, I can't tell you how many strangers I've met in the grocery store, at the gym, who've told me about their mother who committed suicide, their brother who drug overdosed, their boyfriend who died in a fatal car accident. See, grief, death, trauma, loss will touch all of our lives. But what makes it different if we can practice these steps of moving it, telling the story, saying their name out loud, Nolan, 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 writing it down, teaching, sharing, learning. In that way, none of us has to stand alone. In that way, that we mobilize our grief and we keep learning, life, and love alive. Thank you.